Stop scrolling for just a moment, because what you are about to hear is not the kind of message that begins with an answer. It begins with a moment. A tiny moment in the middle of the night when the world was silent, the lights were off, and someone you have been thinking about opened your chat. It was 2:43 a.m. And they did not open it because they were bored. They did not open it because they had nothing else to do. They opened it because something inside them had become too heavy to carry in silence. Pause here, my beloved child, because there is something hidden inside that hour. There are moments when a person can spend an entire day pretending they are fine. They can laugh with people. They can answer questions. They can act distracted. They can convince everyone around them that they have moved on, that they are no longer thinking about what happened, that your name no longer carries any weight inside their heart. But the night removes the performance. When the noise disappears, the truth becomes louder. And at 2:43 a.m., when there was no audience, no conversation to hide behind, and no reason to pretend, their hand moved toward their phone. They unlocked the screen. They stared at it for several seconds. And then they opened your chat. Now listen carefully, because this is where the story changes. They did not immediately type. They did not send a message. They simply looked. Your name was there. The old conversation was there. The words you once exchanged were still sitting inside that little window like fragments of a life they had tried desperately to place behind them. And something happened inside them that they had not expected. Their heart reacted before their mind could stop it. For a moment, they remembered everything. Not just the beautiful memories. Not just the moments when you made them smile. They remembered the silence. They remembered the distance. They remembered the message they never answered the way they wanted to. They remembered the conversation that ended too soon. They remembered the things they said when they were afraid. They remembered the things they wanted to say but swallowed instead. And most painfully, they remembered the moment they realized that losing you might not feel temporary. They had told themselves time would make it easier. They had told themselves they would eventually stop checking. They had told themselves that if they stayed busy enough, surrounded themselves with enough noise, and kept moving forward, the memory of you would eventually become quiet. But that night, something inside them whispered a truth they had been avoiding. You still care. They stared at your name. Their thumb hovered over the screen. And then they almost closed the chat. Almost. But they didn't. Something held them there. Not a physical force. Not something frightening. It was the weight of unfinished emotion. The kind of emotion that does not disappear simply because two people stop speaking. My beloved child, you may have wondered why someone can disappear from your life and yet remain so present inside your thoughts. You may have wondered why certain memories refuse to leave. You may have asked yourself whether you imagined the connection. You may have wondered whether the other person ever thinks about you. And perhaps the hardest question of all has been this. If they cared, why did they let me go? Tonight, in this fictional spiritual message, I want you to step inside that question for a moment. Because sometimes people walk away from something they deeply value not because they stopped caring, but because they were not ready to face what caring required of them. Sometimes pride disguises itself as strength. Sometimes fear disguises itself as indifference. Sometimes silence disguises itself as peace. And sometimes a person says, I'm fine, while privately returning to the same name at 2:43 in the morning. They were there again. Inside your chat. Looking at the conversation. Scrolling slowly. They passed messages they had read before. Then they reached one particular message. And they stopped. Their expression changed. Because they remembered exactly where they were when they received it. They remembered what they felt. They remembered what they wanted to reply. And then they remembered why they didn't. That memory hurt differently. You see, my beloved child, there are two kinds of silence. There is the silence of someone who has nothing left to say. And there is the silence of someone who has too much to say and is terrified of what will happen if they finally say it. They had been living inside the second kind. For longer than you realize. They had written things in their head. They had imagined conversations with you. They had wondered what would happen if they suddenly appeared again. Would you answer? Would you be angry? Would you pretend you didn't care? Would you forgive them? Would you ask why? That last question frightened them the most. Because they did not know whether they could give you an answer that would explain the damage they caused. And at 2:43 a.m., sitting alone with your name glowing on the screen, they realized something they had been trying not to admit. They missed you. Not the idea of you. Not the attention you gave them. Not the comfort of having someone available. They missed the specific way you made them feel understood. They missed the little things. The way you noticed changes in their voice. The way you could tell when something was wrong even when they said nothing. The way you remembered details they assumed everyone forgot. The way your presence made ordinary moments feel meaningful. And suddenly, a memory came back so vividly that they had to put the phone down. It was a memory they had buried. A moment when you looked at them or spoke to them and they realized you saw through the version of themselves they showed everyone else. You saw the tired person. You saw the frightened person. You saw the person who wanted love but was afraid of being loved deeply. And they had run from that. Not because it meant nothing. Because it meant too much. My beloved child, this is where I want you to listen carefully. Do not confuse someone's inability to handle a connection with the absence of that connection. People can be emotionally unprepared for something real. They can sabotage what they secretly desire. They can push away the very person they hope will stay. They can create distance and then cry when the distance becomes real. That does not make their choices right. It does not erase what happened. And it does not mean you should wait endlessly for anyone. But it does mean that sometimes the story inside another person's heart is far more complicated than the story their silence tells you. At 2:43 a.m., they were learning that lesson. They had opened your chat expecting nothing. Perhaps they expected to feel nothing. Instead, they felt everything. Their eyes moved over your name again. They wondered whether you were awake. They imagined what you might be doing. They wondered whether you had finally stopped caring. And then a painful thought entered their mind. What if they have moved on? That thought was different. Because for the first time, they understood that you were not frozen in the place where they left you. You had your own life. Your own healing. Your own future. You could not remain emotionally available forever simply because they were uncertain. And suddenly, the possibility of losing access to you became more frightening than the possibility of reaching out. Their thumb moved toward the message box. They started typing. Then they stopped. They erased the words. They typed again. Stopped again. Deleted everything. Because the first thing they wanted to say was too vulnerable. The second thing sounded too casual. The third sounded like an excuse. And they knew you deserved more than an excuse. So they put the phone down. But this time, they didn't close the chat. They left it open. And they whispered something they had never been brave enough to tell you directly. I wish I had done things differently. That sentence stayed in the darkness. No one heard it. No one applauded. No one responded. But it mattered. Because sometimes the first transformation in a person's heart does not happen when they send a message. It happens when they finally tell themselves the truth. They had been blaming timing. They had been blaming circumstances. They had been blaming misunderstandings. They had been blaming you. They had even blamed themselves. But underneath every excuse was the same reality. They were afraid. Afraid of needing you. Afraid of being rejected. Afraid of being vulnerable. Afraid that if they gave you their whole heart, you would eventually discover every broken part of it and leave. So they tried to leave first. They thought leaving would protect them. Instead, it taught them what absence feels like. And absence became the teacher they never wanted. My beloved child, perhaps you have experienced something similar. Perhaps you have spent nights asking why someone who once seemed so close suddenly became distant. Perhaps you have replayed conversations until you could almost hear their voice. Perhaps you have wondered whether one different decision could have changed everything. But tonight, don't punish yourself with endless alternate endings. You cannot rewrite yesterday. You can only choose what you do with tomorrow. And somewhere in that same night, something was beginning to change, not necessarily in the outside world, but inside the person who had been avoiding the truth. They looked at your chat again. This time, they noticed something they had never allowed themselves to notice before. Your last message wasn't demanding. It wasn't angry. It wasn't begging. It was simply honest. And that honesty broke something open inside them. Because they realized you had not been asking for perfection. You had been asking for clarity. You had wanted honesty. You had wanted to know where you stood. And instead of giving you that, they gave you confusion. That realization made their chest tighten. They sat there for a long time. Then they opened the keyboard again. This time they typed only one sentence. I never stopped thinking about you. They stared at it. Their heart raced. Their finger hovered over send. And then they deleted it. Not because it wasn't true. Because it was too true. They weren't ready for the consequences of saying it. And that is where the night could have ended. But it didn't. Because after deleting the sentence, they noticed something else. A photograph. A memory. Something connected to you that they had forgotten was still on their phone. They opened it. And suddenly the room became very quiet. They looked at that image for longer than they expected. The smile. The moment. The ordinary details. And they remembered how they felt before everything became complicated. They remembered hope. They remembered believing that maybe, just maybe, they had found someone who understood them. And then they remembered the exact moment they started pulling away. Not because you had done something terrible. But because the relationship was becoming real. Real enough to demand honesty. Real enough to require vulnerability. Real enough that they could no longer hide behind uncertainty. That was the part they had never told you. And perhaps they had never even told themselves. The distance was not created by a lack of feeling. It was created by fear of feeling too much. My beloved child, understand something important. A person can love the comfort of distance because distance allows them to imagine possibilities without facing consequences. From far away, they can miss you safely. They can imagine conversations. They can imagine reconciliation. They can imagine what life might have been. But coming close requires courage. Coming close requires accountability. Coming close means answering the questions they avoided. And that is why the next part of their story had to begin with an internal decision. Not a text. Not a phone call. Not a dramatic reunion. A decision. They had to decide whether they were finally willing to stop hiding from their own heart. And at 2:43 a.m., something inside them shifted. They did not suddenly become perfect. They did not suddenly understand everything. They did not magically know what to do. But they stopped lying to themselves. That was the beginning. They whispered, "I still care." Then silence. "I still miss them." More silence. And finally, "I was wrong." Those 3 words were the hardest. Because admitting you were wrong means you can no longer hide behind your version of the story. They remembered the way they had acted. The cold replies. The delayed messages. The moments when you reached out and they pretended to be busy. The times they saw your name and intentionally waited before answering because they wanted to appear unaffected. The moments when they wanted to say, "Please stay," but instead said, "Do whatever you want." They remembered all of it. And suddenly, they understood the cruelty of pretending not to care. Because they had made you believe their silence meant nothing. When in reality, their silence had been carrying an entire storm. They looked down at the phone. And something changed again. They opened the message box. This time, they didn't write a confession. They wrote a question. "Are you awake?" They stared at those 3 words. It was such a small sentence. But to them, it felt enormous. Because sending it would open a door. And they were terrified of what might be waiting on the other side. What if you answered? What if you didn't? What if you were angry? What if you were kind? What if you said you missed them? What if you said you didn't? Every possibility frightened them. They placed the phone beside them. They stood up. Walked across the room. Came back. Picked up the phone. Read the sentence again. "Are you awake?" Their thumb moved toward send. Then stopped. And right at that moment, something happened that they could not explain. A memory surfaced. Your voice. Not your face. Not your photograph. Your voice. They remembered something you once said to them during a difficult moment. Something simple. Something they had forgotten they remembered. And that sentence made them sit down again. Because suddenly they realized they had been running from the wrong thing. They had been running from the possibility of losing you. But the truth was that they had already experienced the pain of losing you. And it had not destroyed them. It had changed them. There is a difference. Pain can destroy a person when they refuse to learn from it. But pain can transform a person when they finally listen. That night, they were listening. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet realization began forming. Maybe the purpose of this connection was never simply to make them happy. Maybe it was also meant to expose what they needed to heal. Maybe you had become a mirror. Not because you were perfect. Not because everything between you was destined to last forever. But because being close to you forced them to confront parts of themselves they had avoided for years. And that is why losing you hurt so much. They were not only grieving you. They were grieving the version of themselves they could have become if they had been brave sooner. My beloved child, if you have been waiting for someone to suddenly understand everything, release that expectation tonight. People change slowly. Sometimes the biggest change is invisible. Sometimes it begins with a person sitting alone at 2:43 a.m., staring at an old conversation and finally admitting, "I don't want to keep living like this." That was the thought that came next. They did not want another year of pretending. They did not want to keep wondering what would happen if they reached out. They did not want to keep checking your profile secretly. They did not want to keep reading old messages. They did not want to keep creating imaginary conversations. They wanted clarity. Even if clarity hurt. And then they opened your chat one more time. They scrolled upward. Further. Further. Until they reached the beginning. The first conversation. The first joke. The first moment when something felt different. They smiled. Then their eyes became wet. Because they realized how innocent it had once been. No expectations. No fear. No games. Just two people talking. And somewhere between those early messages and the final silence, something had changed. They had changed. You had changed. Life had changed. But perhaps the connection had not disappeared. Perhaps it had simply become buried beneath everything neither of you knew how to say. The clock moved. 2:44. Then 2:45. They were still there. Still reading. Still remembering. Still fighting the urge to send something. Then they typed again. This time, the words were different. I don't know if I have the right to come back into your life. They stopped. They read it. Then continued. But I need you to know that I never forgot what we had. Their hands were shaking. They added another sentence. I was scared. And then another. More scared than I ever admitted. They stopped. Their eyes remained fixed on the screen. And finally, they typed the sentence that frightened them most. I think I lost you because I was afraid of how much you mattered to me. They stared at the message. No deletion. No correction. No excuse. Just truth. For the first time, they had written the truth without protecting themselves from it. Their finger hovered over send. And this time, something inside them said, send it. But before they could, they noticed your profile. Something about it had changed. Their heart stopped for a moment. They looked closer. They refreshed. Looked again. And suddenly, the question they had been avoiding all night became something much bigger. Because they saw something they never expected to see. Something that made them wonder whether you had already moved forward. Something that made their hand go cold. Something that made them realize they might not be the only person standing at the edge of this unfinished story. They stared at the screen. Their unfinished message remained open. The room was silent. The clock continued moving. And for the first time that night, they were no longer wondering whether they should message you. They were wondering whether they were already too late. My beloved child, this is where you must pause. Not because the story ends here. Because this is where the truth begins to reveal itself. Sometimes heaven, in fictional stories like this, does not change the circumstances first. It changes the heart that must face them. And that night, the heart that had been hiding from you was finally forced to look directly at what it had done. They had one message. One decision. One moment. And perhaps one chance to say what should have been said long ago. But they still didn't press send. Instead, they looked at your name and whispered something even quieter than before. If you knew the real reason I left, would you forgive me? The words disappeared into the darkness. No answer came. But they were not finished. Because beneath that question was another one. A question even more dangerous. A question that could change everything if they ever found the courage to ask it. They looked at the message again. Then at your name. Then at the clock. 2:47 a.m. Their thumb finally moved. And just before they touched the screen, they saw something that made them pull their hand back. Something connected to a message from the past. Something they had completely forgotten. Something that might explain why this connection had never truly felt finished. And when they opened it, their entire expression changed. Because the message was not from you. It was from them. A message they had written long ago. A message they had never sent. A message containing words that, if you ever saw them, would completely change the way you understood why they walked away. They stared at those hidden words. And slowly, their eyes filled with tears. Because they finally remembered the truth. They had not left because they stopped loving. They had left because they were afraid that if they stayed, you would eventually discover the one secret they had spent years hiding from everyone. And now, at 2:43 a.m., alone with your name glowing on their screen, that secret was no longer staying buried. It was coming back. And what they were about to do next would change the entire story.